April 1848. A column of men leans into a gale on the sea ice west of King William Island, hauling a boat lashed to a sledge. Snow rips past them in horizontal sheets. Behind them, two-masted ships stand pinned and lifeless in the pack, already emptied. Every man in that line will die. Rewind 3 years to a green river and a summer crowd. On the 19th of May, 1845, two ships slipped their moorings at Greenhithe on the Thames. Bands played. Newspapers called the outcome certain. This was the best-equipped polar expedition Britain had ever assembled, and it was going to finish something the nation had chased for centuries. The prize was the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the maze of Arctic islands to the Pacific. For 300 years, Europeans had thrown ships and lives at it. By 1845, most of the map was drawn. Only a few hundred miles of unknown water remained, a gap in the charts that looked almost like a formality. Command went to Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, a veteran of Trafalgar and of 2 brutal overland surveys of the Canadian Arctic. On the first, 11 of his party died, and he survived by eating lichen and the leather of his own boots. The public loved him for it. The Admiralty considered him safe, experienced, and lucky. His ships were famous already. Erebus, named for the Greek darkness at the edge of the underworld, and Terror. Both were converted bomb vessels, built to absorb the recoil of enormous mortars, which made their frames unusually massive. Both had just returned from 4 years in Antarctic ice under James Clark Ross. Then came the refit, and it was extraordinary. Each ship received a railway locomotive engine, adapted to drive a screw propeller that could be lifted clear of the ice. Iron plating armored the bows, steam pipes carried heat through the living decks. They carried a library of over 1,000 volumes and an organ that played tunes by hand crank. In the holds went provisions for 3 years: flour, salt meat, rum, lemon juice against scurvy, and roughly 8,000 tins of preserved food. The tinned goods came from a contractor who won the order late and cheap, and delivered at speed. The seams of those cans were sealed with lead. Nobody thought that worth recording. They crossed the Atlantic to Greenland and anchored to take on stores. Letters went home from Disco Bay, cheerful and confident. 5 men were found unfit and sent back aboard the supply ship. That left 129. They are the number history remembers, because not one of them was ever seen alive by European eyes again. Late July 1845, in Baffin Bay. 2 whaling ships met them, moored to an iceberg, waiting for the pack to open toward Lancaster Sound. The whalers noted their good spirits and sailed on. That is the last confirmed sighting. After it, there is only wreckage, testimony, and bone. Then, nothing. No dispatches. No returning boats. 1 winter passed, then a second. In London, the silence was explained away as delay, as ice, as an unusually hard season. By 1848, the Admiralty could no longer pretend. What had begun as a voyage became the largest search operation of the 19th century. The first hard evidence came in 1851 on a scrap of gravel called Beachy Island. Searchers found the expedition's first wintering camp. The stone footings of a storehouse, a forge, sledge tracks, and hundreds of emptied food tins stacked in neat heaps. Everything was orderly, and there was no message anywhere explaining where they had gone. And they found 3 graves set in a line in the frozen shingle, with carved wooden headboards still standing. John Torrington, leading stoker, dead the 1st of January, 1846, aged 20. John Hartnell, 3 days later. William Braine, a Royal Marine, in April. 3 deaths in a first winter was not catastrophic. It was, however, a beginning. What Beachy did not reveal was the route they took next. In the summer of 1846, the ice released them, and they turned south down a channel called Peel Sound, deeper into unmapped water. Somewhere ahead, lay King William Island. On the charts of the day, it was drawn as a peninsula. On the 12th of September 1846, the ice closed around them off the northwest coast of King William Island. That is the date recorded in the only written record ever recovered. They had come within roughly 100 miles of water already charted. The passage was almost complete. The ships never moved under their own power again. The trap was geographical. West of King William Island, thick multi-year ice grinds down without pause from the polar ocean. Had they passed east of the island instead, they would have found shallower, gentler water. That choice, made from an inaccurate chart, decided the fate of 129 men. Winter took them. For months, the sun does not rise at that latitude. Temperatures fall far below anything a wooden hull can hold in. The men lived by lamplight in damp, freezing decks, thawing what they could, while the pack outside groaned and cracked and squeezed the ships until the timbers screamed. Then the sun returned, and the ice did not open. On the 11th of June, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. We do not know how. We do not know where his body was placed, and it has never been found. He died believing, perhaps, that the passage was days away. Command passed to Francis Crozier, a man who had spent more of his life in ice than almost anyone alive. A third winter came. Scurvy would have arrived by then, opening old wounds, loosening teeth, draining strength. Tuberculosis moved through the crowded decks. The tinned food, sealed and stacked for a fourth year, was running out or turning. By spring, 24 men were dead, 9 of them officers, a death rate among the leadership that makes no ordinary sense. On the 22nd of April, 1848, they abandoned both ships. 105 survivors walked out onto the ice under Crozier and James Fitzjames, and set off for the mouth of the Back River, a route of hundreds of miles across frozen ground toward a trading post they could not realistically reach. Before they left, they emptied a cairn on shore and filled in a standard Admiralty form. It carries 2 messages. The first, from May 1847, ends with the words, "All well." The second is scrawled around the margin, 11 months later, in a cramped hand, reporting the deaths, the abandonment, and the march south. It is the last word any of them ever wrote. The march went south along the western shore. Inuit hunters who encountered them later described men who were thin, weak, and unable to speak the language, hauling a boat, some falling as they walked. The bodies were left where they dropped. The line grew shorter with every mile of that coast. At a place on the southern coast, searchers later found a ship's boat still mounted on its heavy sledge with 2 skeletons inside. Around them lay the cargo the dying men had chosen to drag: silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, slippers, curtain rods, a stack of books. Almost no food. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained it. In England, one person refused to let the silence stand. Lady Jane Franklin spent her fortune and her reputation lobbying the Admiralty, then funding private ships when the Admiralty gave up. Rewards were posted. Newspapers ran the story for years. Her grief became a national campaign, and it kept sending men north long after hope was rational. More than 30 expeditions went looking, and by sledge. They charted thousands of miles of coastline, discovered channels nobody had seen, and in doing so completed the map Franklin died trying to finish. Several of the searchers themselves became icebound and had to be rescued. For years, they found nothing that mattered. Then, in 1854, a Scottish surveyor named John Ray met Inuit on the Boothia Peninsula. They described a party of white men who had starved to death near a large river to the west. They sold him relics, silver forks. Ray also reported what the Inuit told him about the final days: that from the state of some of the bodies, the last survivors had been driven to the last resource. Victorian Britain reacted with fury. Charles Dickens publicly attacked the account and the credibility of the witnesses. Ray was denied the honors his discovery deserved. 5 years later, an expedition funded by Lady Franklin reached King William Island. On the 6th of May, 1859, Lieutenant William Hobson opened a cairn near Victory Point and found the document with 2 messages. Nearby, his party found skeletons lying on the shore, a boat, and scattered gear, exactly where the Inuit had said they would be. Modern science reopened the case. Exhumations at Beachy found bodies preserved in permafrost and elevated lead in their tissue, pointing at the tinned food and the ship's water system. That theory has since been challenged. The lead levels may not have been unusual for the era. Scurvy, tuberculosis, and starvation remain the certainties. The bones told the harder part. Analysis of remains recovered from the island's southern shores found cut marks consistent with the deliberate removal of flesh, and marks on bone ends suggesting they had been boiled. In 2024, DNA identified one subset of remains as Captain James Fitzjames, one of the 2 men who signed the final note. The ships themselves stayed hidden for more than a century and a half. Inuit oral history had always said let a look. One vessel sank in deep water to the west, another settled in a bay where a mast stood above the ice. Researchers finally listened. Those accounts, passed down through generations, were the map. In September 2014, sonar found Erebus in shallow water off the Adelaide Peninsula, sitting upright on the seabed. 2 years later, Terror was located in the bay that now bears its name, almost intact, hatches closed, windows unbroken, china still on the shelves. Both lie exactly where the Inuit had always said. The wrecks answer where. They still do not answer why the ships were left while they were still afloat, why some evidence suggests men returned to them afterwards, or where Franklin lies. 129 men sailed into a gap on a map, and the Arctic closed over them so completely that we are still reading their handwriting in the ice.